Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of This Week in San Diego Soccer History. I'm John Cross, along with Dylan Wilson, and tonight we are going to do part 2 in our series looking back at the 25th anniversary of the San Diego Spirit. We'll do some trivia, as we always do, but one of those trivia questions is going to extend actually into a longer segment, and that's pretty much going to be our show with those two big segments. So before we jump into everything, Dylan, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing well. It's been an all right week. How about yourself?
Doing all right. The weather has cooled off. We had some rain, which is, nice for us. We could always use the rain. It looks
Yes.
like it's shaping up to be a nice weather week here in San Diego. So the kind of weather we all pay a rich premium for living here.
Yes,
So
we
hopefully we'll see
sure
more of
do.
it. All right, you ready to jump into our trivia question that we left off with last week?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let me go ahead and pull that up. So our question was, who scored the first regular season goal for the San Diego Spirit? And when we left last week, I said I didn't know the answer at the time, which I didn't at the time. We all know that Shannon McMillan scored in the preseason and had those goals, but we wanted to know who scored the first regular season goal. And you had offered up a guess. What was your guess?
Shannon McMillan.
Shannon McMillan. That is the safe choice, right? I did know that the Spirit, they didn't score, but they lost their opening match and didn't score. And then it was a 0-0 draw in their second match. I knew that. It wasn't until their third match that they won, but I couldn't remember off the top of my head who scored. But the Spirit would win 2-0. And yes, Shannon McMillan scores both goals. So that was probably the safest, possibly easiest trivia answer to a trivia question we have had so far. But yeah, it was Shannon McMillan. And if you didn't guess Shannon McMillan and you pick someone else, you missed the obvious choice there.
Sometimes Occam's razor, right? It's a thing for a reason.
Right. So, and again, I didn't know it. And when we asked the trivia question we're going to leave you with at the end of today's episode, I have an answer, but I'm not entirely sure if it's the correct answer, or not the correct answer, the only answer. So we're going to, we'll talk about that when we get to that question at the end, and maybe our listening and viewing audience can help us out a little bit to make sure it is the correct answer or if we're missing something on that. But we'll get to that at the end of the show. Let's go ahead and jump into some birthdays for this week. We just got a couple. We're recording this, as always, on a Tuesday, so April 14th, 2026 for us today. Tomorrow, on Wednesday, April 15th, is Brian Farber's birthday, longtime San Diego Soccer. So wish happy birthday to Brian Farber, who is still with the Sockers, even though he's not playing. He, along with Eddie Velez and Paul Wright, are now coaching the new women's indoor team that started this year and have had a couple of exhibition matches and should be entering the women's league for the MASL next season, I believe. So we'll have to get out and see if we can catch some of those games next year.
I have heard nothing but great things about the new arena in Oceanside. I just never ever get up that way.
Yeah, I am really considering going. I'm going to be busy on Saturday, and again, for me with my health, it's difficult to do multiple things over multiple days. I have something already scheduled for Saturday, but I really, really want to try to make it out to the soccer semifinal match on Sunday this weekend. So that is the plan. I'm going to try to do that and probably transit out there, maybe not transit back, but we'll get a ride back. But I think I'm gonna try to transit out there and see how that works, since they have a station right near the stadium.
Yeah. I didn't realize the station was near the stadium. That's good to know.
Yeah, just a couple blocks away. Although it's at least getting to the stadium, it's uphill. Downhill when you come back, but uphill when you're going there. To finish off our birthdays, our other birthday this week that we're highlighting is Kristen McNabb, current defender for the San Diego Wave. She is also the last player remaining from the original squad back in 2022. And being one of the original players, she is the one, we mentioned this, I think, on the last episode, that she right now holds the record for most appearances for the Wave at 86 or 87, somewhere around there. And then let's see, we'll move on from birthdays, look at some of our news and current events for people who are setting records around San Diego and things that we will want to remember later. The first person that I am going to spotlight is Scarlett Camberos. She plays for the Mexican national team, so we are in an international window right now. So Mexico had one of their World Cup qualifiers this last weekend. On Friday, they had a 9-0 victory over the U.S. Virgin Islands. Scarlett Camberos, is a Buena Vista High School graduate, and she had a goal and 2 assists and a FOTMOB rating of 9, and that was all in the first half. She got substituted at the half. So one of our local players that has gone on and has been pretty much a mainstay on the Mexican national team recently. Big shout out to Scarlett Camberos. And then on the men's side for SDFC, they are having a little trouble lately, but they did get their 100th goal in the last match against Minnesota United. So a big shout out to Luca Bombino, who's going to be the answer to the trivia question of who scored the 100th goal for SDFC in all competitions. And that was in the 7th minute over the weekend in their loss to Minnesota United. Couple thoughts though. Have you been watching any of the SDFC matches?
Here and there, but I've been keeping up
Recently?
with the results. I've seen they've had quite some discipline issues.
They have had quite the run of red cards. I mean, 6 reds in the last 6 matches across all competitions. 3 reds in their, total of 7 MLS matches. And that puts them on pace for 14 for this season. Now, unlikely they're going to get up to 14. A lot of times, they come in small waves, and then you're going to have long stretches where no one's going to get a card. But they are having a little trouble on the discipline side, as you said. Do you know what the current MLS team record is for red cards in a season?
I did not off the top of my head. I see it now in the notes, but
Go ahead. If you see it in the notes, you can
so,
go ahead.
yeah, sure, yeah. So apparently the record is 8, and you're telling me that that's in a season. The record is 8 from
for
FC Dallas in 2014.
Yeah.
Well, they're certainly on pace to break that.
To shatter it if they keep on the same pace, which I don't think they will. We may
Well,
look
now
back at
hold
the end of
on.
the season.
There's something to be said for an unbreakable record. I'm just putting that out there.
Yeah, all right. That is one of those records that we would certainly make note of, but not one that is probably the one you look fondly back on.
No, I'm just
in
joking.
terms of setting those. And I've watched some of the highlights and stuff, and feels like a couple of those things have been on the harsher side, but they certainly are having a run of red cards lately. But the bigger acknowledgement we want to give is to Luca Bombino for scoring the 100th goal for SDFC in their very short existence here. So just over a year of playing matches, and they have 100 goals is just really quite impressive. And then the last person that we're going to shout out here, at least that we have in our rundown, is Jude Terry. Now, a lot of SDFC fans kind of keep on saying, might be happy that LAFC lost their first match up in Portland and had their first goal scored against them. But what I want to highlight out of that match is the one goal that they did have. And I don't know, did you see the highlights at all for this particular match and goal,
no,
Dylan?
I kind of was out of the loop on the scores this past weekend.
Yeah, if you get a chance, you should go back and check it out. It is a beautiful curling shot into the upper corner from about 20 yards out. And the goal came from 17-year-old Chula Vista native Jude Terry, who got his first start with LAFC, has been part of their academy system since he was 12, been involved in the youth national teams already for several years. But again, local product, getting his first start, getting a beautiful goal, and at 17 looks like he has a bright future ahead of him. Already getting some playing time on a very strong team, even though it was a heavily rotated squad they used because LAFC, again, we're recording this on a Tuesday, they're playing tonight as part of the CONCACAF Champions Cup. So they had a big, heavy rotation for their MLS match this last weekend. But getting the call and getting the opportunity and getting the goal, a good shout out and promising future it looks like for Jude Terry. And then the other thing, I guess, to maybe mention about this is for decades, San Diego County youth players on the men's side, because we don't have the academy infrastructure on the women's side developed yet. But on the men's side, we would get a lot of our strongest players go to the LA Galaxy Academy, LAFC Academy, go out to Arizona and go to the Real Salt Lake Academy. With Right to Dream starting up, it'll be interesting to see how much that changes over the next decade and how many of these strong players stay here locally and come up through the Right to Dream Academy and then move on from there. Or possibly out of the Right to Dream Academy and go, to any of the other teams. But it'll be interesting to see how the Right to Dream Academy fundamentally changes some of the scouting and recruiting in Southern California in general, but especially in San Diego County.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the whole hope, right? Especially with SDFC's willingness to play the youth. Having that clear and obvious pathway so much more close to home. Yes. Yeah, I mean, would be good not only for the players' development, but right, like for the community. You hope to kind of see them, kind of grow in the community, in the team.
Yeah, I think it'll be fun to watch some of those. They have their first class in there. I don't think they have their second class yet, but they have their first class in there at the Right to Dream Academy. So we'll be probably within the next 2 to 4 years, we're going to start hearing some of those names as they get a little bit older and get into the 16, 17, 18 age range and are ready to make their debuts somewhere.
Well, I mean, if obviously a little bit different, but if you just take the 4 years of Loyal and their very minimal academy that the USL does, that was part time basically, already 2 professional careers have come out of it, or 2 MLS careers with several other USL careers right at that academy. So the talent is there. It's just about giving it the platform.
Right. And speaking of one of those academy products, we were talking about this right before the show started, and it wasn't in the rundown because it just happened as we're getting ready to record this live, and we have Open Cup matches going on tonight. And I noticed that there was an upset, which we enjoy the cup sets. Louisville beat Austin, and I didn't look closely at the lineup or anything else, but I did see that the goal scorer for Austin in that losing effort was CJ Fodry, one of those people you were just talking about from the Loyal Academy and moving on and now having professional careers, as we said, 2 of them in MLS and others playing in other places. But CJ Fodry getting the goal. Instead of last year, he got the goal that sent them to the final. This year, he gets the goal, but in the losing effort as they get upset by Louisville tonight.
It looks like he came off the bench. Thought Mob's not giving me how many minutes he played, but he came off the bench.
Okay.
So scored in limited minutes.
Yeah, that's good. I think he's been doing a lot of coming off the bench in games this year. So, and he's still, I don't remember his age right now. He's got to be 20, 21, somewhere around there.
Yeah.
So he's still got a lot of years ahead of him, and hopefully a bright future as well. All right, Dylan, do you have anybody else? There's anybody that we missed coming up for this week to give a shout out to in terms of San Diego players?
I don't
Anything?
think so. I think I'm all good. I think we covered it.
All right, and then for our listeners, if we missed something, let us know. Send us a note. A couple of the people that we have mentioned over some episodes have been because some people have dropped us a little note like, "Hey, you should follow this person," or "You should check this out." Scarlett being one of them. So it's good for us to get our radar on as many people as possible that have come from the San Diego area. So drop us a note and let us know if we are missing anybody who should be, that we should put a spotlight on in terms of San Diego soccer. All right, ready to get to our first trivia question for this episode.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so our first trivia question for this particular episode, and it's going to tie into some of the things we'll be talking about today, but who was the first U.S. women's national team player to become a soccer mom during her U.S. women's national team career? Now, those last four words are really kind of important because depending how you phrase the question, there could be two different answers to this. We're going to give the answer after we do our segment on the San Diego Spirit, but that's going to lead us into our kind of bonus little bit of soccer history segment that we'll do afterwards. And part of the background for this is, as we said, we're in the international break. The U.S. women's national team just had a match against Japan and playing Japan again tonight, I believe, as part of this 3-game series. But Sophia Wilson made, her reappearance, I guess, back in the team after having her child. And she becomes the 18th soccer mom in U.S. women's national team history. And there is a long, I'll say somewhat fraught history of mothers who have been part of the national team pool and then coming back to play for their national team, or soccer players in general. And the difficulties of one becoming pregnant and then having a child and then coming back and having a chance to play at a high level or for your national team. So we're gonna dive into that a little bit in our final segment this evening. But our question specifically is, who was the first women's national team player to become a soccer mom during her U.S. women's national team career? And Dylan, I don't want to give you, we'll let you have a guess later, but in
I
your
had no
mind, do you
idea.
have
I
no idea? Okay.
No, I got
So we
nothing.
will obviously do the answer like we always do after our first segment here. But before I'm saying we're not missing anything, are we? I think we're ready to jump into that first section. I was just double checking the rundown. And let me make sure I have my notes ahead of me so that we can get started. But let's go ahead and do that. Let's jump into our main topic, which we usually save towards the end. This week, we're shuffling some things around a little bit. We're going to bump this more to the front because it's going to dovetail nicely into the answer to our question and then to our little bonus history segment we're going to do afterwards. All right, so Dylan, are you ready to get started with San Diego Spirit Part 2?
Let's do it. We are establishing the WUSA.
Yeah, so in Part 1, we, and I encourage people, if they haven't listened to it or watched it, go back and do that. But in Part 1, we looked at the 25 to 30 years before the launch of the WUSA and what was going on in women's soccer during that time period. But where we left it off, we got right up to the point with the Women's Victory Tour, which we're going to talk about again here in just a second. But then, the strike and the walkout that they had in January of 2000. And then as they're getting ready to talk about, at least on the WUSA, to launch their women's league, all of a sudden Major League Soccer jumps in and says, hold on a minute, we're going to put in a bid for the first division women's league as well. And that's pretty much where we left it in part one. Now, obviously, if you know your history, the WUSA was the one that won out. But I think it's important that we take a little bit of a deeper dive. We just really glossed over it last time, but take a deeper dive as to how all this played out, what lessons can be learned, especially looking back at it from a 2026 lens, and and look at how these things played out, because I think they're important to a lot of the conversations around women's professional soccer in this country and the women's national team program in this country. So we'll go ahead and do that. So before we start, Dylan, did I miss anything, or do you have any questions or comments about finishing up that part one and before we jump into part two?
No, I think you about captured it. I do want to say I'm having internet troubles, it seems. So if I turn off my camera, that's why. I'm just trying to account for that.
Got it. Thank you for letting me know there, just in case. So let's jump in, kind of almost do a quick recap of 99, and then we're going to go month by month for a little bit in the year 2000 as we go through the second part of how the WUSA was actually established. So if we remember, in 1999, we had the Women's World Cup, of course, but really the bigger picture behind the scenes was what happened around the Victory Tour. And if you remember from part one, and again, if you haven't listened to it or watched it, you should go back and do so. But there was that big fight with the Federation, and eventually the US women's national team players, they stuck together, and they were successful in doing this Victory Tour that they wanted to do to help promote the game of soccer in the US, rather than do the Africa Tour that US Soccer wanted to do, to go play a match in Egypt and a match in South Africa, which really, I would argue, based on the comments I've read from the women's side, just seems silly. Why are we going to Africa when we need to promote the game here, right? And we just won the game here. We won the World Cup. We ought to be, taking advantage of that in our own country. So there was that kind of, I'll call it a fight for right now, with the Federation, which I think most people would say the U.S. women's national team won in that sense. They didn't back down. They held their ground. And they got basically what they were looking to do. Then we get into January of 2000, and there's the January camp. There's a tournament down in Australia, and the U.S. women are looking for a better contract. So the U.S. women's national team players want a better contract than they have. And we have to remember, again, back at this time, the same thing happened early on in the men's program. But before we had professional leagues for national team members to play in, the Federation paid the players. They basically signed a contract with the Federation, and they played lots of games together. This is why so many of those players who were part of that 99 team and played through the 90s, they have so many caps, right? Because they played almost like a club team. They played whenever they could and got chances to go play in tournaments. And that's how they kept sharp, because there was no professional league for them to play in. So the U.S. women in January were arguing for a better contract. They had this big tournament, as we said, in Australia. And it was in Australia because the Olympics in the summer of 2000 were going to be in Melbourne. And, basically the women walked out. They had their own strike. They wouldn't participate. U.S. Soccer had to get, scrubs basically, but young players through the national team program to come represent the U.S. The U.S. team did not show well in that tournament. And by the end of the month of that January in 2000, the U.S. women's national team players had a new contract. It was announced, I think, the 1st of February in 2000. But again, it was another battle they had with the Federation. They stuck together as a group, and they won again, another fight with the Federation. So that takes us into February. And as soon as the new contract is announced and everything looks like it's good to go heading towards the Summer Olympics in 2000, um, the WUSA formally starts making their announcements. They actually legally form as an entity because they're going to be a single entity structure. We know the main person who's behind it now, which is John Hendricks, the founder of the Discovery Channel. He's got lots of other people involved, lots of other investors, and they all seem to have ties in some way to cable channels or cable operations or cable companies. But certainly a lot of these cable companies are together, and they have raised basically about $40 million. They announce that there's going to be 8 teams in the league. It's backed by the U.S. women's national team players. The former women's team national coach, Tony DiCicco, is going to be the commissioner. And they're working on a TV contract, which nobody seems to be worried about because these are a bunch of cable channel, billionaires that they're going to work out something in terms of getting the league on television. So there seems to be a lot of excitement coming in through the month of February. And I think there's a couple things also to note about this, because these people who are part of this backing group, there are some people within this group that helped them with the victory tour and were good allies to the women's national team program, before the 99 World Cup when they had the earlier talks about forming a league. But as we talked about in part 1, they bumped that conversation, or not the conversation. Conversations were still happening, but the idea to launch a league, they decided it would need to happen after the Olympics in 2000, because then they'd have a little bit of breathing room to get everything off the ground. It's just too hard to get it going before the 99 World Cup, and then no time really between the 99 World Cup and the 2000 Olympics to try to get a league going. So these are a lot of the same people. They've been having conversations for years. And one of the things, like, I think looking back at it from a 2026 perspective, you can really see how this whole league from the investor side was really made for television. They did a lot that they could to really try to market this sport and their product, both the sport and these players, in a way to make it, digestible to the American public, but also to get it on television. I mean, it was a TV league, really, when you think about it. Probably from the investor standpoint, it was a TV league more than it was a soccer league. But very importantly, it was a sports property. And if you know your, I will say, broadcast economics, if we could simplify it down, to a very simple level, sports generate revenue. This is why the networks, before we had cable, like to have sports program. You got a lot of eyeballs all at once watching a sporting event. You can charge more for advertising. And as television broadcast started shifting to the cable space, it was the same thing. Now, instead of having 3 main networks and some local channels, now you've got tons of channels. Like, you get a cable subscription and you get several hundred channels in your cable package. And now, all those channels, and so they're fighting for the same number of eyeballs that the networks had. So you need to have good shows that attract good numbers. And we usually talk about that through the Nielsen ratings, was the old standard way of measuring that stuff. And then, you charge more money for advertising, which allows you to fund and do your other things. But sports are the big money makers. So these investors knew that for their cable channels, competing against the big networks to try to get in to get NFL rights or NBA rights or Major League Baseball or any of the real big sports was going to be tough for them. It was going to cost a lot of money. But if they could be on the ground floor of a new sport property that was going to be successful, then it was theirs, right? And they partly own the property and they own the channel, so they weren't going to, they're investing in it because it's their sport property, but they're not paying a huge fee for the rights for that particular property. So they're investing their money, a little differently, but it was important for them to try to have a sports property. And a sports property, I think everybody at that time really thought was going to take off. Everybody had super high hopes. And for the women, let me back up to the investors. I don't think, again, this is just me putting in my 2 cents. I don't think the investors were really looking to take advantage of women's soccer or the players. I think both groups really saw the advantage of each other because the women's program knew they're never going to make it on network television. It was going to be a hard sell to try to get games there. So most people have cable. People could still see their matches. I think there was a good cooperative relationship where they could each benefit each other, which led to good productive conversations for this WUSA group as they were having these conversations throughout multiple years trying to actually make this league happen. So that's just, kind of some background, and that's where we were in February. So before we get to March, and kind of, because this is where things start to get a little ugly, we'll pause for a second. And Dylan, if you have anything you want to jump in with before we move to March.
Mainly just worth observing the power of labor solidarity, just apropos of nothing.
Well, I think that is one of the biggest messages to take away from this whole ordeal, and almost everything that the U.S. women's national team pool players have gone through and the culture that they established. And I think it's, I don't know, maybe if I term it or phrase it in terms of union busting, I think when you have a group that has already been, that hasn't had the advantage that they have not been able to get things to happen their way. I'm blanking out on the word that I really want to use here. I think for them, like for the women in this case, like some people say, well, on the one hand, if you fight it and don't get what you want, then you're not going to get anything. I think for a lot of these women, it's like, we don't have it anyway. What have we got to lose?
Yeah.
And I think, and that is really the power of sticking together. And they did. And I think there's so much that people can learn from this when you are, I don't know, you look at the union management kind of issues, or anytime a group of people need to stick together to enact some kind of change. I think it's a lot easier for, say, US soccer to go in and kind of union bust or pick off people on the men's side, because I think it's easier, it's not harder for the men to organize. I think it's just easier to pick some people off away from the organization, because you can kind of say, hey, well, if these people weren't screwing it up for you, you'd be able to take advantage of this. Women didn't really have that. What was there to take advantage of? They were already getting screwed all over the place. So
Right.
it really needed, sticking together really helped them push their causes forward. And one of the things, again, I think is remarkable for the decades that the culture was formed and this group stuck together and kept fighting for what they wanted, kept chipping away and making things a little bit better for the group that came after them every time. So let's get into March, where it starts getting, ugly. And we hinted at this at the end of episode 1 last time. So in early March, US Soccer announces that the formal bid submissions for the league were due by April 1st, so that they have time to look at it, approve it if it's going to be approved, and so the league can start the following year, because WUSA was looking to start in 2021, in April of 2021. So
2000. 2001,
sorry?
you mean?
2001. Thank you. I said 2021, didn't I? Yeah, 2001. So they were looking to start in April of 2001. So this comes out in early March, and I remember this at the time. I think most people just thought U.S. Soccer is announcing it's more of a formality. All through February, the WUSA is just like they're very open and transparent what they want to try to do. You've got national team players that are talking it up, and everybody's getting excited for this league. And then in late March, and really about a week before, within the week before submissions are due on April 1st, Don Garber comes out and announces that MLS is, quote, prepared to compete against, end quote, the WUSA. Like they're going to put in their own bid for their own league. And I'm going to pull out some quotes from people. And really, I mean, looking back at it from a 2026 lens and kind of understanding all the history that's happened since, it really is, I find it disappointing reading some of these statements, and to me comes across as some of the very coded misogynistic language. When you look back at, but I remember living through it, and there were an awful lot of people who had a voice, journalists, other things. There were things, on posts and forums, and there were a lot of male soccer fans really concerned that if this league gets started, because MLS was only 5 years old, it was just barely getting going, that it could hurt or ruin Major League Soccer. And there was an awful lot of talk like, well, we can't let this league undermine Major League Soccer. Like, and if anything, we maybe need to get Major League Soccer off on a stronger footing before we even consider having a women's league in place. I mean, there were a lot of those kinds of conversations that were happening at that time, especially again when you get into forums and other things. And as a young adult male at that time and being involved in that stuff, I remember those conversations quite a bit happening. Some of the other things Don Garber said or thought, and he said, MLS believes that the formation of a women's professional soccer league creates a unique opportunity for the entire sport of soccer in the United States. And then when you read that with the other things, just seems like, yes, this could be a wonderful thing if we have it. As long as we get to have it, it could be wonderful. But they come out and they say they're going to put in a bid. U.S. Soccer will have it before the April 1st deadline. Their proposal with Major League Soccer would only have teams in current MLS cities. It wouldn't necessarily be all of them, but they wouldn't be in places that don't already have MLS teams. And then there was a comment that was made that regarding the two groups, or specifically directed towards the WUSA, said, at this point, while the potential for cooperation exists, it seems as if their approach is to remain as independent from the men as possible. There was a lot of little drops like, we want to work with them, but they're not really wanting the help or not wanting to work with us. U.S. Soccer announced decision will be made by August at the latest, but highly unlikely that U.S. Soccer would sanction more than one D1 professional league. So really right now we're looking at, it's going to be a fight coming down or some kind of merger or agreement or something between these two leagues. So in April, we have some big movement. So before we get into that, Dylan, I'm going to give you a chance to jump in before we jump into April. So here's where we are. Both groups have submitted their bids. We have two competing bids. They're sitting there with U.S. Soccer. And then before we jump into April, I'll let you jump in.
Well, it's kind of interesting because I, not so much in a sporting sense, but in a political sense, I kind of, in some of my readings, have been kind of going back over some of the like early 2000s kind of media post 9/11 era and some of the kind of civil liberties stuff that happened right thereafter. Obviously, this is not a podcast. Something that has blown me away is the casual, extremely misogynistic things that are just like in the media as recently as when I'm old enough to remember. that, like, I don't,
Yeah,
I was young enough at the time. I don't really remember it, like, because you're not quite old enough to see that lens yet. But like looking back
right.
at it, like, I mean, like things that I would consider not even really saying, like, in my own time and space, like in headlines of major newspapers. It's like, it's kind of insane.
Yes. And it is, when you look at it through a 2026 lens, it is very different. But I remember being there, again, a young adult white male at these times. And, um, you know, I can certainly also see where I have grown over my lifetime and with different life experience, because the way I look at things now in 2026, I am certain as a young adult white male, I was not looking at them and reading them the same way I read them today. Um, and I remember being excited about the league, but it was just kind of in the background. I followed it. I was interested in what people were saying. I remember thinking at the time, I can kind of see both arguments. But now when I look back, again, with a variety of other life experiences and soccer life experiences, um, I definitely read it and see it in a much different light than I did then. All right, so let's get to April of 2000. And both groups have submitted bids. So the one that's loosely been dubbed WMLS, I don't know that MLS ever came out and used that phrasing, but you had WUSA, and I think for people in the media and other things, it's just easy to slap the W in front of MLS and just kind of run with it to distinguish between the two bids. If we look at some of the pros and cons, I mean, for the WUSA, they had investors lined up, $40 million of kind of seed money already to get started. By this point in April, they had their TV deal with Turner. So that means games are going to be on TNT and then CNN SI, which was the, the cable channel at the time. It was backed by the US women's national team players, and they were being very public and transparent about everything they were doing. The one big con was they didn't really have any experience doing their own league, which of course Major League Soccer did. That was one of the huge pros for Major League Soccer. They had 5 years of experience of doing a Division One league in the United States. They also had their own TV deal, ABC and ESPN. They also had Spanish language on Telemundo. They had some regional things with the Fox regional networks. I mean, this is also to see how different our media landscape is now. We just don't really have regional networks, at least not the same way anymore. Um, MLS had two stadia that they owned, right? Because again, single entity situation. And they were building at that time 3 new ones. I can't remember off the top of my head which were those 3 new ones that were coming online. Um, but one of the biggest cons for Major League Soccer was that while they had submitted a bid, unlike the WUSA, Major League Soccer, the details of their plan were non-existent publicly. Don't know what was submitted in the bid, don't know any of that, but it really wasn't out there in the public for other people to consume and really look at the two, other than MLS saying, we have the experience, kind of like trust us kind of thing. So you had those two groups, those kind of the pros and cons. And then US Soccer also is kind of throwing out some hints of where they might go, either through some direct quotes from, say, the president of US Soccer, or from, just reporters saying from sources and things. So there were things like some journalists writing stuff like that the US Soccer might be hard pressed to sanction a league that seems to be unwilling to work closely with the federation. That was clearly, comments like those were a dig to the US women's national team players that had two very high profile fights in the last year. And if we're talking winners and losers, I mean, the US women's team pretty much, they stuck together and they got pretty much what they wanted from the beginning. So, and US Soccer kind of lost both of those. So when you start seeing these kind of statements come out in articles like, well, it's going to be really hard for US Soccer to sanction a league that they don't think they can work with, or make comments like, while we're aware what U.S. women's team national players might want to do, U.S. soccer can't make sanctioning decisions based on just those factors. They have to make them on what's good for the game of soccer overall, which again just felt very coded kind of language. The president of U.S. soccer at the time, Bob Contaguglia, said, I'm aware of the women's desire to have a league of their own, and I can sympathize with that, but they have to respect our needs as well. And again, reading that, again, 2026, just really doesn't come across very well. He also had some comments where he talked about that MLS has some legitimate concerns, and also that some people are concerned that if MLS even tries to take this on, it could hurt Major League Soccer, that maybe this isn't in the best interest of Major League Soccer to do this. Maybe it is better that we go the WUSA route. So again, a lot of these were out in the media. But again, one of the last comments by the president of U.S. Soccer is saying that ultimately, when they decide what bid would be successful or approved, there was this comment said, what makes a league successful are many different components: stadiums, marketing, sponsorships, etc. And this is a much bigger issue than just one or two players, which certainly feels like a dig to people like Julie Foudy and Mia Hamm, which were definitely out front in the media in this fight, fighting for the things they wanted to see in the WUSA. So there's people in the back channels trying to help mediate, figure out how they can work things out so they're not trying to pick one league over the other. The WUSA put out a plan that they called a 4-point cooperation proposal, and that outlines some sharing of stadium and scheduling to prevent encroachment, and really comes across as WUSA saying, yeah, we're going to work together, but stay in your lane over there. Don't come into our area. And MLS and Garber responded basically saying that Major League Soccer proposed a very deep involvement with the WUSA on the league and at the club level, but the WUSA came back with a proposal that was not deep enough for Major League Soccer's concerns. Garber went on to say, with the right agreement, we would not go forward with our proposal, the MLS proposal. However, if not, we will go forward with the MLS proposal. So, it's just like some subtle public threats. Like, we want this to be a closer alignment, and if you're willing to do that with us, then we'll drop our bid. But if you don't, we're moving forward with our bid. If you want to kind of do this by yourself.
Well, it also very much sets up the look what you made me do kind of angle.
Right.
So
all this is all going on throughout the month of April, but the big thing, and to me, what fundamentally shifted this entire conversation was about mid-April, the U.S. women's national team players, all the ones from the previous World Cup, like they'd basically been working as a group, as a single unit, and they had their spokespeople. And instead of just saying they support the WUSA bid, they actually all went in and signed a binding contract saying they would only play for the WUSA and would not play for Major League Soccer at all. And again, to have that whole group go to this was probably what fundamentally changed the conversations in April. Once the U.S. women's national team pool players did this, again, stuck together, and again, like a union, stuck together and decided this is the horse we're backing, kind of thing, and we're willing to jeopardize their future soccer and World Cup careers, because if that isn't a league sanctioned by U.S. Soccer and they potentially play in a renegade league, then they can't play in World Cups. But which probably wouldn't have happened anyway because you couldn't get enough other people who are going to be willing to play in that league and jeopardize their World Cup participation. But those players, at least on their own, and I think what came across to Major League Soccer, if I'm putting on one of the hats of those people who are probably in the room, is if you can't get a single one of those U.S. women's national team players to come play at your league is done. Like, there's no way you can get a league. And if you are the ones, if these women then decide to boycott the Olympics this summer because of this, or not participate any further, all these great players, and you are the reason for it, and that's how it comes across in the media, I think once that happened, MLS lost their leverage for the most part. And funnily enough, by May, they had come to an agreement. WUSA was going to move forward. MLS was going to drop their bid. MLS was happy with, their partnership. Basically, we're going to work together and not step on each other's toes was kind of the super generic kind of statement. And I don't remember, and I couldn't find anything doing my research, if there was anything concrete that ever made it out into the public. It was really more behind the scenes, Major League Soccer saying, we're happy now, we're dropping our bid, they can move forward. And they did. And as soon as that happened in May, the WUSA did their player allocation draft by the end of May. I think it was May 24th. And they had identified by this point now 24 players, so they could get 3 players out to each club. And San Diego then ends up with Joy Fawcett, Julie Foudy, and Shannon McMillan. And while there are a lot of great female players in this pool, I don't think San Diego could have done much better than getting those 3. One of the top defenders for the last decade, yes, getting a little older, but tons of experience. And if you're starting a league and you got some younger players coming through, what a great person, role model. You got the captain of your U.S. women's national team in Julie Foudy. You got a great goal scorer in Shannon McMillan, and she's a local product, right? Like, San Diego couldn't have done, I think, any better in getting those 3 allocated and becoming part of the San Diego Spirit. And they're all from the Southern California area. So San Diego is the only soccer team kind of in this region of the country. So those people who were from Southern California definitely wanted to try to be on the San Diego Spirit, especially since there were no LA teams. In August comes around, US Soccer approves the WUSA bid. Now, they could do that allocation with the other players before they were officially sanctioned because those players had already signed contracts, basically. They were the exclusive agreements to play with the WUSA. So they did that early allocation draft of national team players. US Soccer approves the league in August of 2000. They go out to Australia. They participate in the Olympics. They take home the silver medal. But now they're back, and now everything is cleared off the table. WUSA is sanctioned. They're going to kick off in April of 2001, and they've got 6 months to get the league going. And I think at this point, this is where we'll stop part 2, so we can pick up how they built the rosters and got into the preseason and the early part of the first games of the inaugural season for the WUSA. We'll do that in part 3. So before we completely wrap up this particular section, Dylan, any closing comments on the WUSA/San Diego Spirit here for part 2 of our segment?
Well, I mean, I think we kind of already touched on it. The kind of through line here is the solidarity of in this case, the people who had this kind of shared experience. But I think really more broadly, like labor solidarity is a really important kind of through line here.
Yeah, and it is, and it seems to be for the males running U.S. soccer a constant point of frustration. And I think that constant point of frustration is from never taking a step back and looking at it from the women's national team players' perspective. They just kind of wanted to keep doing things the way they've always been doing things. And I think I think these women over here were causing frustrations for them, making them have to work and do things that they didn't think. I, I don't want to say didn't think were necessary because I don't know what these people were thinking, but certainly seemed to be an inconvenience.
Well, I think
And I
it's,
think,
I mean, we're getting way into speculation here, but I think it's a natural downstream consequence of the way we approach sports, specifically, pretty much everything in this country with a business first mindset. So, like, of course, you're going to hate labor solidarity because that's what business hates. So it just like
right,
when you look at it like just, I mean, I know people hate when you compare American soccer to European soccer, but and I know that European soccer wasn't necessarily great about the women's game until more recently, but there's a more kind of collectivist mindset built into it. The clubs are representations of the community, not a business first, although, or at least in theory. So I think it's really just kind of a natural downstream kind of aspect of that culture.
right. And then, you know, that business side of it is going to rear its ugly head as we get into our next segment. So this is kind of a good transition here. So let's go back to our trivia question that we had. I'm going to put it up on the screen one more time here. See if that's the right one. Yep. Who was the first U.S. women's national team player to become a soccer mom during her U.S. women's national team career? And again, those last four words are important, and we're going to explain why in a second. So, Dylan, do you said you had no guests before, and I know you have access to the notes, and I don't know if you've seen them, but do you have a guess or anything now on what the answer would be, or who is the
Well, I
first
think
U.S. women's?
I would say my guess would probably come down to one of the three players you noted earlier. So I would give myself a 33.3% chance of getting it right. SoCal,
Well,
San Diego focused here.
and since we typically do our questions that way, you would be correct. You do have a 1 in 3 chance. You want to take a guess? Oh, it looks like we just lost Dylan.
No,
Maybe he's
sorry. Like I said, my internet's a little spotty. I'm still here in voice at the very least. Yeah, I mean, hey, it's steered me well so far. I'll stick with Shannon McMillan.
okay. It is not Shannon McMillan. The correct answer is Joy Fawcett. And it's interesting because if we look at the San Diego Spirit, we're going to get into this probably in the next episode. But Joy Fawcett was pregnant with her third child and didn't actually start on the field with the San Diego Spirit when they started their season. It wasn't until I think closer to August, July or August, that she came back with the team. But she was, and she is regarded as the first U.S. women's national team player to have a child and then come back and play for the U.S. women's national team program. And I think we should dig into that because two things. One, she was not the first mom, the first player to have children to play for the U.S. women's national team. But this whole idea of allowing a female athlete the opportunity to start a family and then come back again was not common. And I think to understand how she became recognized as the first mom, there's kind of an interesting precursor story there. So we're going to jump into that here for the last part of this episode. And look at how this came about, because the person who was the first mom, the first soccer mom playing for the U.S. women's national team, is a woman by the name of Joan Dunlap, and it was about 10 years before Joy Fawcett. The difference being she already had her child before she started playing for the U.S. women's national team, and her story is very interesting. And if that hadn't happened, Joy Fawcett's situation might not have happened. And we're going to get into the details around that here in just a second. But let's go back to Joy Fawcett first. And Joy Fawcett in 1993, So we had the 91 World Cup, and then we didn't have soccer in the Olympics just yet, not till 96. And then there was going to be the 95 World Cup and the 96 Olympics. And in looking ahead, Joy Fawcett decides that she wants to start a family, she and her husband. And she talks to the then head coach of the U.S. women's national team, Anson Dorrance, who was also the coach of the University of North Carolina, and they became a women's powerhouse in the early 80s, winning tons of championships on the women's side. So he was the big college coach. He became the women's national team coach. And she told him, hey, I want to start a family, but not only do I want to start a family, like have the time off and then be able to come back, I want to be able to bring my child to work, basically. I want there to be some kind of accommodations to help and have the child come with me. And Anson Dorrance was good with it. He didn't have a problem. And there's a reason that we're going to get into later because of an experience he had specifically with Joy Dunlap about 10 years earlier. So he's fine. But again, at that time period, early 90s, this was not common. We had more and more women playing soccer and more playing at a professional level around the world. But it was way more common that if a female player got pregnant and decided to keep the baby, the contract was terminated. And very unlikely anybody was going to sign that player ever again. Because again, if you get down to the nuts and bolts of business, why are we paying this player if they're not playing? That was the male dominated attitude. So if you got pregnant as a female player, that was usually the end of your career. You were done. No matter how good you were, no matter how well you could come back afterwards and still play, there were very few teams that were willing to take a risk on you because what if you got pregnant again? You've already proven you can do it once, right? So it could be the end of somebody's career. In fact, even with the national team, the U.S. women's national team, in 2009, when Pia Sundhage was the coach, Kate Markgraf went out. She had twins. She was on bed rest for a while, gave birth to twins. 3 weeks later, Pia basically canceled the contract. Said your contract's not going to be renewed. Which again, for these players at that time is devastating because their contract is with U.S. Soccer. That's where they're getting their salary. They're not really playing for a club team. But she did that, and of course, the U.S. women's player pools rallied around. They put Markgraf in touch with their attorney, and from my understanding, there were a couple of options. She could sue and probably win a lawsuit and make lots of money and have college funds for her kids and live comfortably and never have to play soccer again. Or, I mean, there were several options, but one of the other options, and Kate Markgraf decided she's going to put her head down and prove to the coach that you need to sign me again. I'm that good. I'm coming back. But also, as again, this U.S. women's national team player pool, we're then able to use this as leverage in their next CBA. And basically, some iteration of what had become called the Markgraf rule has been part of the U.S. women's CBA ever since. That you can't cut someone because they get pregnant. Now if the U.S. Soccer is paying your salary, you're guaranteed your salary and or appearance fees, however the contract is working as a national team player. And you have to be, guaranteed salary. And once you're medically cleared, you have to be invited to the next 2 international camps to be able to have a chance to show the coach that you're ready to be back, right? You can't just be passed over and say, well, we're looking at other people. Like you can't even give someone the option to use some other kind of cover that they don't want them back because they got pregnant, right? They have to be back. So that has been part of their contracts and their CBAs ever since. And again, this is at the U.S. women's national team level, but this also didn't quite work its way down, say, to the NWSL. The first 10 years of the NWSL, it was not great. I think it's fair to say not great for mothers in the NWSL. Some teams were much better than other teams, but like lots of things, if you don't require something to happen, like we're seeing this right in the bargaining with USL and their Players Association, if it's not required, then some teams won't do it. Eventually, FIFA in 2020 mandated a worldwide policy for professional players that you have to have 14 weeks of maternity leave, and you must get at least 2/3 of your salary during that time. And clubs were obligated to reintegrate new moms into football activity, and the teams had to provide adequate ongoing medical support. And again, FIFA put those as minimums, but they really become minimums/maximums because there's very few clubs that are going to go above and beyond if no one tells them they have to. Go to 2022, the NWSL in their CBA update. There was a lot then that changed in terms of making sure these policies for pregnant mothers were part of that collective bargaining agreement. And what was interesting, several studies around this time, the clubs who did make that effort to integrate moms and their children in with everything they do as the club had better club cultures and climates, and where a lot of the male dominated, say, hierarchy at certain clubs found the kids to be a distraction or would blame them as a distraction for a loss, or it messed up training and things. Polls and surveys with the players found that the players really appreciated having the young kids around. They found it a stress relief, actually, from the soccer, that they got to go be aunties to whatever kids were around. So it's very interesting to see how that culture has shifted for the better in most cases, especially in this country, but still not everywhere around the world. And that started, at least on the national team level, with Joy Fawcett, but really Joy's situation is, one interesting aside before I forget, after they passed that CBA in 2022 in the NWSL, the very next year, they saw a significant rise in pregnancies among their players because people knew they weren't going to be cut after that. So definitely didn't force people to choose between family and career. And again, we have good examples even in the NWSL of clubs who have made it a priority for that family, the family leave, the allowing having nannies around to help out, allowing mothers to bring their kids to practice and travel with them to away matches. There's really it's getting better and better. Still not still not where it should be, but getting better. And again, started with Joy Fawcett, but in order for Joy's situation to happen, and because her coach was Anson Dorrance, was probably influenced by what happened 10 years earlier with Anson Dorrance and Joy Dunlap. So before we get into that, Dylan, do you have any questions or comments that you want to jump in with before we talk about Joy Dunlap?
I mean, I guess it's important to remember how recent that CBA is, when the NWSL kind of, and to be fair, the NWSL is a pretty progressive organization as far as American Sports League goes, insofar as how they treat their fans and the players, generally speaking. But remember that it was only 2022 when that CBA was finally passed, when when these corporate structures wax lyrical out there respect. And again, coming back to the labor solidarity, every single one of these victories has been won through the experiences of somebody like Joy Fawcett or Joan Dunlap, like you're about to get into. So
Right. It, and people had to fight for these. They weren't ever going to just be
mhm.
given to them. It's like you said, to get back to the business, the fundamental economics. Those people who are running the business side of things are looking to cut costs and maximize profits. And family leave, those kinds of stuff don't fit into those numbers of bottom line, but they certainly fit into the culture. Um, and and having good work environments, which if you're trying to be a winning sports team is something you really need to look at as well. Um, but yes, it's something that you know we've had anyone who's been marginalized in any way has had to fight for, and usually a group of people have had to stick together to fight for those things. So let's go back to Joan Dunlap, and we're gonna go all the way back to 1980. 1980, we talked about in our first episode of the San Diego Spirit series how we had this explosion of women's soccer due to Title IX, because we had it in the high school setting and then the college setting, and then also just in the amateur sports setting. We had some hotbeds around the country where lots of females were playing, and we had leagues and teams. And even US Soccer started the National Amateur Cup for women back in 1980. We had the men's competition running since 1927. So this is not the Open Cup, but the National Amateur Cup. So we finally got a league in 1980 that the women could participate in. And Joan Dunlap, who was 18 at the time, she was playing for a team up in Seattle and the Pacific Coast International Sharks. And this team made it all the way to the finals. They're in the final match. They're playing against Camp Springs from Maryland. The game is tied 1-1 at the end of regulation. Nobody scores in extra time. And then 18-year-old Joan Dunlap scores the winning penalty to claim the title, which is a cool story just in and of itself. But the bigger picture is here. She scores it. She's done. She's played this long game, but nobody on the field knows, apparently, except for her and her doctor and maybe a few other people, is that Joan is 5.5 months pregnant when she plays that game and scores that winning penalty kick goal to secure that first championship in the National Amateur Cup. And she is, by all the accounts I've read, lightning fast. They call her Joan Jett because of her speed. Her first 3 steps, they say, are faster than almost anybody, that she can just separate quickly. And then she's got speed as well, that she just opens up the gap. But she plays this, the doctor gives her the okay, and she does it. She ends up having the baby, obviously, a few months later. Thought she would be with her high school sweetheart. By the time the baby is born, realizes that it's just going to be her and the baby moving forward. But she keeps playing soccer. And, way back at this time in the late 80s, this is when college coaches went and traveled around to different tournaments to watch people play. And not everyone on the men's side or the women's side, but even on the women's side, were recruited right out of high school. There were a lot of females for the college programs as they're trying to fill out all these scholarships so they can maintain their Title IX compliance, especially all those schools that want to keep their American football programs. They're scouting all over the place, and they're sometimes pulling in people who might be 19, 20, 21 years of age, to come and then play soccer. So somewhere along the way, Anson Dorrance is at a tournament, sees Joan Dunlap play, and basically says, I need this player to come to the University of North Carolina. Eventually convinces her to come, but in their conversations, and by this time her son is 2 years old, she says, look, I've got a 2-year-old kid. I don't think I can do this. Like, no one in her family has graduated from college. And Anson Dorrance says, we'll make it work. You get a full ride. We're going to provide you with housing, and we'll get you daycare. And your child can come to, come to practices, can travel. Like, we will help you with everything you need. Anson Dorrance talked with her family. They worked it out, and she went. She went and played for the University of North Carolina. She was one of their top forwards, and she brought her child along. They got her a place like just off campus. They had daycare on campus, which a lot of universities provide. So she was able to take advantage of that. And then her son came with her to lots of practices anyway. And for 2 years, he was part of the team while she was playing there. He was part of the team as well. And he had a whole team of aunties, just all the same stories you hear about, like Alex Morgan and her children. There's all the US national team players and other players that bring their children along with them, and how the rest of the teammates all act like extra aunties around. So this thing with Anson Dorrance, because he wanted the player, right? He helped make that happen because he wanted that player to come play for University of North Carolina. But Anson Dorrance had that experience. And then in the mid 80s is when they formed the very first, attempts at US soccer really organizing a US women's national team. So Joan Dunlap was part of those early national teams, those ones that went to Italy when they had those first matches, those first 2 tournaments in Italy. She was there for both of those. And, if you want to ask the question, who was the first soccer mom on the US women's national team, it's Joan Dunlap. But the whole reason that Joy Fawcett could probably, have that conversation with Anson Dorrance is because of the history Anson Dorrance had with Joan Dunlap and the experience, and he knew we could make it work. If Joy Fawcett if Pia Sundhage had been the women's national team coach at that time, probably wouldn't have happened. Joy Fawcett probably would have been cut, and who knows what would have happened around that time. But having a national team coach like Anson Dorrance, who had the experience, who made it work before with a young player in the college setting, also knew he could make it work. Like they'd figure it out and make it work on the national team level. And then people then got a chance to see Joy Fawcett have a child and come back. And then after that first child, and then she had another child somewhere in between this, but between 95 World Cup and the 2000 Olympics, Joy Fawcett played every minute of every major tournament for the US women's national team and really helped set the bar to show that it can be done, right? And you get one of those trailblazers that show you that it can happen. But doesn't mean just because one person shows you it can happen that all of a sudden it's magically going to change. As we saw, 10 years, I guess 10 years later with, more than that, 15 years later with Pia Sundhage, canceling Kate Markgraf's contract after she had her twins. Right? And we still have places around the world, and I'm sure we still have teams within this country that would not sign a female player, especially if they could get away with it. And I'm sure they wouldn't use it as an excuse, but if, would probably not want to sign a female player if they had a thought that she might get pregnant, which is a shame. All right, Dylan, we'll give you a chance to jump in with anything before we wrap things up here.
Well, just a good reminder that the wheel of progress is not always linear. There's going to be, sometimes a few steps forward and a couple steps back. So, keep fighting the good fight if it feels like not making much progress at times.
Well, and that's the thing. It's always a fight as well. It doesn't have to be a nasty fight, but it's always a fight that you have to fight for those things so you can get them, to have them in the future. And you need to band together with people to have that fight. But I think, again, you had mentioned a couple of times in this podcast earlier, but I think one of the big through lines through this whole U.S. women's national team story and the starting of the WUSA is the to me, the inspiration of this group who just kept facing wall after wall after wall and could have caved at any time. I could have said, it's too much, but didn't, and fought through it every step of the way to make things better for every player who came after them. And for the most part, that culture has stayed within the U.S. national team program
Well, I was
and has continued.
I was going to say, anecdotally, I think that culture is still very much alive, at least in the women's national team. Probably not at all in the men's national team, but whatever. That's a whole other conversation. But as an example, in the women's national team, Alex Morgan, when she was in the career, moved to Tottenham's women's team in the Super League, I guess they call it, or whatever it was at the time. And Tottenham's women's team was like merely a few years removed from basically being an amateur outfit at that time. And she came in and demanded better for the rest of the team. Said, I'm not playing. I'm not, like, I know it's this contract. I'm not playing until we're training at this new shiny training facility that the men are training at, until we're playing in the stadium as well. And, she didn't have to do that. She was getting paid a bunch of money either way. So that kind of sense of duty to the peers, I think, absolutely permeates to today in the women's national team setup.
Yes, and I think one of the byproducts of Title IX, the very, very good byproducts of Title IX, is that not only did we open up athletic opportunities for women, as one of the court cases and deciding that, again, which was never the original intent of Title IX, but it was for educational opportunities specifically. And I think what has happened is you've taken a lot of women that and were able to get college scholarships that might not have otherwise been able to go to college. Maybe some of them would still be able to go, but you got a full ride. I mean, you got it paid for. So you have a whole, throughout many decades with our U.S. women's national team program, you have very smart, educated women who are, demanding something better moving forward. And I think I'll have to say, for a lot of the males who are involved, especially in U.S. soccer, you've got people who are coming up, who are facing you in terms of education that are your equals, if not better than you. And I think for a lot of them, it was a shock at the time to have this group of women constantly demanding more, as they 100% should have, but constantly demanding more and more. And every time the U.S. Soccer Federation gave in, they probably were hoping that was the end of it. And then they turn around and say, okay, like, we did this step, and now we're moving forward another step. And now we're going to move forward another step. And we're going to keep moving forward till we make this a more equitable playing field. And again, as I said, they, especially at my age and looking back over what they had done, and I know I didn't appreciate it at the time, all the things they were going through. But certainly I can appreciate it now, what they had to fight for and how they stuck together to keep making it better. As we said, I just feel like I've said the same thing about 20 times this podcast, but it is it is an inspiration what this group has done in the past and continues to do moving forward as a program. Okay. I think that kind of wraps it up for us now. So a couple of things. We'll be back next week for another episode. We'll do part 3 in this series before we, like in the San Diego Jaws, switch gears again. So we'll bring us up to the start of the season for the WUSA. And then we're going to start looking at some other things before we go out. Before, I guess, a little bit later this calendar year, we're going to look at some stuff for the Soccers specifically, because it's also the 25th anniversary of the, God, I don't know if it's the second, I guess it's probably the second iteration of the Soccers. So we'll probably look at that a little bit later this year as well. If you would like to get in touch with us, if you have a suggestion for a show topic, if you would like to help us out, as we've said before, because a lot of research goes into these shows, we could always use some help. So you can contact me. My email that we're using temporarily right now is john@bigpinedigital.com. So feel free to reach out with me where you have an answer to any of our trivia questions. Dylan, I'm going to let you jump in for any other last comments before we get to our trivia question that we're going to leave them with, if you have any last things to say.
I don't think so. I think, I've kind of, like you said, kind of said it a few different ways, a few different times.
All right. Well, let me go ahead and pull up the last trivia question here. Okay, so who was the first brother-sister sibling pair to play at the senior level for the U.S. men's national team and the U.S. women's national team? Now, we're bringing this question up because in this last window, the U.S. played Japan, and we saw the Thompson sisters, Alyssa and Giselle, just set a new women's national team record for siblings starting in the same match together. So this is the fourth time these siblings have started in the same match, surpassing the record, I guess, by Sam and Christy Muse. And we've seen this. We've seen siblings on the female side, sisters playing at the U.S. women's national team level. We've seen it, brothers on the men's national team. I believe the most recent are the Aronsons on the men's side, and I believe they're the 8th brother pair that have both played together at the senior level. But in my research, I've only found, I don't know if there's others. So I'm asking this question, who were the first? Because I think they were the first. I also think they're the only. But who are the first brother-sister combination to play, one for the U.S. men's national team and one for the U.S. women's national team at the senior level, so at the top level? Because we've had some examples of people in youth programs, but never quite made it to the senior level. So we're looking for a brother playing for the U.S. men's national team, a sister playing for the U.S. women's national team at the senior level. So we will leave everybody with that question. And I really, really hope there is someone out there who has a different answer than I have, because I'd love to learn about that. But I stumbled across this, didn't even know it was a thing. I'd never heard about it before. So I went trying to search, and even when I tried to do searching, it was very difficult to even find the one I stumbled across. So we'll give the answer, obviously, at the beginning of next episode, like we always do, but we'll give our listeners and viewers a chance to go investigate that and see if they come up with the same answer I did, or if they can find another one, which, as I said, I really hope they do. I would love to be clued in to another one of these samples. All right, Dylan, any final thoughts before we head on out?
Just Colorado Springs did end up going on to win that game, so we had another cup set tonight.
Got another cup set tonight. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everyone for watching and listening. Send in your trivia answers. You can do it here on the YouTube channel, or you can send an email to me. Again, john@bigpinedigital.com. We'll reveal the answer to that at the beginning of our next episode of This Week in San Diego Soccer History. All right. Until next time, everybody get out and support your local San Diego soccer. Good night, everyone.